As I beheld the expanse of the Thames extending outwards from my place upon the deck, I found myself thinking that this, too, had been one of the dark places of the earth. It, too, had been a land of endless wildlife, camps lost in the swamps like needles in a bunch of hay. I found myself reminded of the jungle. But that isn't where it started. It began in Brussels, the city of white sepulchres. My aunt, yes, a woman, had found me a posting upon a steamer in the Congo, and as I shared tea with her, she became incredibly excited, positively carried off her feet. She spoke highly of ideals and virtues, and though I was not the largest fan of European society, I still found myself holding on to them as I left. It was only as I arrived in the jungle that they began to fade away. Before I had arrived, I had already seen strange things. For instance, a group of Frenchmen shelling the jungle from off the coast. They seemed rather invested in the work, and as I could not see their enemy, I wondered if perhaps it was slightly overkill. However, when the savages in the jungle made a display of violence towards them, it proved to be perfectly justified. I landed in a camp in which the people seemed to be very bored. At one point, they had declared war upon a cliff. When I inquired as to why, it did not respond. I also encountered many dying men, but I ignored these in favor of my focus upon a large man in a white suit, who I found more worthy of my attention, but none of this was particularly important, and I began a march to a station inland through the jungle. It was a treacherous and long journey. At the station we reached, I encountered many other strange occurrences, including a shack which burst into flames, and the ensuing fight, in which a worker was run off into the jungle after a prolonged struggle. However, none of the things I had seen before or even since compared to the horror, the anguish, the torment I felt at my lack of rivets. Where are my rivets? I, and I dare say no man, had ever experienced such pain as waiting 6 months for rivets to arrive. However, while I was waiting for the rivets, I did discover an interesting painting made by a man they called Kurtz. It depicted a woman in the darkness holding a candle, blindfolded. I thought it might be symbolic, but I was in too much pain waiting for rivets to truly interpret the meaning of the piece. I also discovered a pamphlet written by this Mr. Kurtz. It was a very nice read, idealistic and virtuous, until the last few lines, which I found rather strange. In these nights, as I waited painfully for rivets to arrive, the jungle itself seemed to speak to me. It seemed to say foreboding, cruel threats and warnings. It seemed to speak to me like a primeval beast of old times.
Hey, you suck. Get out of here.
Finally, however, on an auspicious and truly blessed day, the rivets arrived, and myself, the manager, several other pilgrims, and several savages departed from the station on my steamer. We were finally heading up the river to find Mr. Kurtz. On this voyage, as I observed the cruelty of my fellow pilgrims, I began to think often of 3 metaphorical devils, that of violence, greed, and desire, as taking control of our ideals. However, in reality, there appeared to be more than 3 devils. Perhaps 12 or 20. There were several of them, in fact. As we transited the river, these devils, physical and metaphorical, proved to be the least of our worries. The jungle was ruthless. It was as though we had been transported back in time to an era when beasts and monsters ruled the earth. There were primeval, horrible things in those trees, but worst of all, there were men in the jungle, corrupted, their hearts withered away by the wildness they lived in. One day, my helmsman, who I was quite nice to, was fueling the boiler, which I had told him contained an evil spirit that would kill us all if he failed to tend to it, when he began to climb up towards the upper decks. As he walked alongside the cabin, we came under attack. Arrows began to fly from all sides. In one moment, the helmsman was struck down. I saw him die with my own eyes, and I saw him fall at my feet, bleeding on my shoes. It annoyed me greatly. I had to throw away my nice shoes, and I was so upset it was the only thing I thought about until we reached a strange house down the river. I entered this decaying house, and within it I found a book who I could not read, for it was written in some form of cipher. However, something gave me the impression it may be Russian. Finally, after much delay, we reached the station of Mr. Kurtz. We all left the steamboat. The manager walked up the dock to meet the man. I, on the other hand, met with a strange young man who told me he was a Russian. He appeared to be dressed like a harlequin.
Repent, harlequin!
The harlequin told me of Mr. Kurtz's many treasures and conquests. He told me of the immense riches the man held within his station. As I looked around at this point, I began to see terrible things. Horrible things. There were no rivets here either. I knew then why Mr. Kurtz must be sick. Despite his somewhat violent protests, we managed to get Mr. Kurtz upon our steamer and embark for the journey back to the central station. However, as I knew would happen, Mr. Kurtz, in his deprivation from rivets, began to decline in health, until finally, one day, he lay in bed and I knew he was dying. He looked up to me, not focusing upon my face, but upon something beyond it, and he said to me, "The horror, the horror." I knew what he meant. We buried him in the mud, in a shallow grave. I told myself it was symbolic and a metaphor for his life, but in fact, it was quite easy and cheap, and that is why we chose to do it.